into the work of the Samud Story House, which is where my own work began. And now I don't just work with Palestinian communities in North Bethlehem. I work with multiple communities, both Palestinian and Israeli, across a wide geographical area. And the doctoral research that I'm just finishing is on storytelling, community and memory among Palestinian and Israeli youth. And I'm especially interested in the way stories are transmitted across borders. Now, a border could be physical, like the wall, or like the segregated streets and road networks that exist here. Or it could be more figurative, like a boundary between generations, or the linguistic boundary between Hebrew and Arabic, or an ethnic boundary. And working on these different borders and fault lines has brought me into confrontation with an approach to narrative that's very, very popular in the field of peace education and peace studies, especially in relation to Israel-Palestine. It's called the dual narrative approach. And according to the dual narrative approach, the best way to understand the conflict is that you have two sides, and each side has got its own story. And the best way to achieve peace is for the two sides to come to an understanding and an acceptance of each other's stories. But Israeli and Palestinian societies are both extremely diverse, both in terms of population makeup and in terms of the experience that different groups of people within each society have had. For example, Palestinians living in central Bethlehem have had a very, very different experience of military occupation from Palestinians living in the Aida refugee camp, who have had a different experience again from Palestinians, say, in Galilee, who now hold Israeli citizenship. And equally in Israeli society, the Mizrahim, the Jews of Arab origin, living mostly on the periphery of the country, have had a very, very different experience, say, to Israelis of European origin. And so I decided to take another approach, viewing historic narrative not as just one discrete thing, but as a mosaic of intercommunicating stories and memories, as Ayal Navis says here. Historic narrative can no longer be taught only as only one story and memory, but as a mosaic of intercommunicating stories and memories. And I think this approach helps us to get around some of the major pitfalls with story and narrative in Israel-Palestine. Right now, there's often a view that there are two stories and they're competing for space. And as Michael Rothberg explains, while there can be no doubt that many manifestations of contemporary violence, including war and genocide, are in part the product of resentful memories and conflicting views of the past, the conceptual framework through which commentators and ordinary citizens have addressed the relationship between memory, identity, and violence is flawed. Against the framework that understands collective memory as competitive memory, as a zero-sum struggle over scarce resources, I suggest that we consider memory as multi-directional, as subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing, as productive and not privative. And this is where my own research comes in. I'm looking at how the stories are transmitted across these boundaries, and how young people deal with histories and heritages that are supposedly off limits to them. And this other useful thing about this approach is that it doesn't only help us to gain a more nuanced and richer picture of how young people imagine the past, the present, and community through storytelling. It also helps us to deal with the question of power and balance. According to the dual narrative framework, you have two equal sides, two equal stories, struggling for dominance. Yet this is an asymmetric conflict. When I tell you to picture the stories of the children I've worked with as forming a mosaic, it's not a two-dimensional mosaic. We need to realize that some pieces are pressed much lower than others. Like the Palestinian children in the Aida refugee camp, for example, are among the most marginalized and disenfranchised people I've ever met. Their life is a whole world away from that of their Israeli peers who live just 3 miles down the road in the settlement of Efrat. And I can tell a story that illustrates this perfectly. It's one of the first stories that I gathered in Palestine. And it was from a young woman named Ruwaida. She's 17 years old. And Ruwaida was telling me the story of her dreams. At night when she falls asleep, she often suffers nightmares. She dreams that her bedroom wall erupts and soldiers appear. And this often used to happen in the Second Intifada because the houses in Aida are very tightly packed together and the soldiers were afraid of paramilitaries. In order to get from house to house to do searches, they used to blow holes in the side. And then I also heard from Ruwaida that when she goes to sleep, she doesn't sleep in her bed, she sleeps in a chair up on the roof, a plastic chair. And I jumped to the conclusion that she's sleeping on this chair because she's frightened of being in her room, because of the exploding walls, because of what happened when she used to be a little girl. It was only when I got to know Ruwaida a bit better that she trusted me to say, it's because of the nightmares she wets the bed, and there isn't enough water to clean the sheets, and she's so ashamed. So she sleeps on a plastic chair. And going to the Israeli community in Efrat, I worked with some young children who are also very, very frightened. Young children whose only picture of a Palestinian is a terrorist or an exploding bus or a high body count. And when they heard I lived in Bethlehem, they asked me, isn't it scary there? What's it like? And they were astounded that I'd actually walked out of my community in Bethlehem, up the hill, and met them alive. And their fear is very, very real. All these children are absolutely terrified. But some children are lacking basic necessities like water. And they lack basic freedoms and basic civil rights, which isn't an issue for others. And that's something you need to bear in mind as we progress to the rest of my talk. This is the Aida refugee camp. And this is where we're going to stay now for a few stories. As you can see on the screen, the separation wall cuts very closely through the camp. It's extremely overcrowded. The houses are very basic condition. We have a mosque and a community church. And there are lots of tanks on the roof for gathering rainwater because of the water shortage issue. This is actually a powerful clue. You can tell which is an Israeli house and which is a Palestinian house by the number of tanks on the roof for water. And one of the topics I've done with all the children I've worked with is narrating landscapes, hidden landscapes particularly, how they talk about the places they can't see, the places that are off limits to them, that they're not allowed to visit. And Aida refugee camp is a really good place to start with this because, as you can see, the physical landscape is dominated by the wall. And all the residents in this camp need a permit to move beyond the West Bank. And as the West Bank is so carved up by different checkpoints and roadblocks, they hardly move around in the West Bank at all. So for kids in Aida, this is their world. They hardly ever leave it. I remember last Christmas they were so wildly excited because they were going to be taken in a bus to see a Christmas tree in the town square. And I came in and they were so excited they were practically swinging from the roof. Miss Vicky, shatter, shatter, the tree. And I was looking around, where is this tree? And like, oh, we're going to see it. So for most of the time they're restricted to here. And the first activity I ever did with them, I asked them to draw me a map of their community, but not a literal map, more a figurative, conceptual map, showing me all the places that are most important in their life. It could be any place, doesn't matter where. And one boy, he asked me, can I go outside? I want to draw the wall. I said, okay. He scurried out, he came back in about 2 seconds later, and I asked, that was quick? And he said, yeah, I got scared. And a soldier was looking at me from the tower, and I was frightened they would arrest me. And again, this isn't an unrealistic fear. Child arrest is a very real phenomenon. And so he sat down to draw his picture inside. And I walked around this circle of children drawing, and I came to another boy, and he'd drawn that. I don't know if you could see it clearly, but it's just a picture of the wall. Another child had coloured in the whole piece of paper grey. There was nothing on it, it was just pure greyness. That's the most important place in his world, and that's how he imagines the world beyond, because right now that's all he has. And working with Israeli kids too, this metaphor of greyness and darkness continued. I remember sitting with two Israeli teenage girls in a town called Ra'anana. It's up towards the north of Israel. And I asked them, what comes to your head when you hear the word Gaza? And the answers they gave me were darkness and empty space. And that's what I heard again and again regarding Gaza and Palestinian areas from Israeli kids. One girl volunteered that she pictured unfinished houses, because when she drives to visit her family living in Israeli settlements in the West Bank, she sees a lot of dilapidated, unfinished houses. But she couldn't imagine what life is like inside, because that's completely separate from her world. And the Palestinian kids too, they struggled to imagine the Israeli world on the other side of the wall. Like, often they spoke to me, these kids, about last night Jews came into the camp, into the refugee camp. And I asked, who are Jews? And they said, oh, it's the soldiers, it's the army. And I said, are there any others? And they said no, because that's all they know. And then one little boy who's a bit of a dissident at the back, he stuck his hand up and he went, yes, there are others, I've seen them, they speak French. And I was intrigued at where he got this idea from, but he wasn't exactly able to articulate it. And there was only one boy who was able to actually coherently try and imagine Israeli Jewish life as it is on the other side of the wall. He drew this picture. And as you can see, there's the wall in the foreground, and then there's the Dome of the Rock Mosque in the background, and there's a little smiling figure. And at first I thought this was a picture of the artist. And I saw that there's a door drawn in the wall, and I thought that he'd drawn himself a door, and he'd gone through, and he'd gone to visit his mosque. So I said, is this you? And he said, no, that's not me, that's the soldier. And I did a double take, and I looked at the picture again, and I realized there's something strange about this. Because most of the Ida kids, when they draw soldiers, they draw them as a big group, a clump. And they don't draw them with faces. They're stick men carrying guns or in tanks. This soldier has a face. And as he carried on with his colouring in, 12-year-old Jihad, who did this picture, he said to me, you know, I hate the soldiers, but I love them too. And the teacher who was in the room practically dropped what she was carrying, and she went, what, are you crazy? And Jihad was quite unperturbed, and he said, I hate them when they're doing what they do to us. But I think when they go home, they're like us. And that was the first sign I had that one of these children had got a picture of the soldiers having a home life outside the camp. And I tried to push it with Jihad. I tried to say, come on, tell me, imagine, what's that house like? And he drew, in reply, he drew me a picture of a house with a closed door and two smiling men standing outside. And he said, this is the soldiers and this is their house. And I said, okay, what's inside? And he said, I can't go in and find out. They'll point their guns at me. So he'd reached a point of blockage. And a big part of the work I did in storytelling with both the Israeli and the Palestinian kids was how to get them past this block and imagining the lives of the other. And a major thing that helped was the use of fairy tale and folklore motifs. For example, I did some work with a 12-year-old girl in the settlement of Efrat. And she wanted to talk about Gaza, but she didn't want to talk about Gaza. Her dad had been sent there during the incursion of 2014. And he'd received a phone call in the middle of the night, and he'd put on his army uniform and off he'd gone to fight, in Mary's words, whoever's fighting us. But she wouldn't use the word Palestinian, she wouldn't use the word Arab. So I asked her, what's it like in Gaza? What's happening there? And she just shrugged. first-person voice she wasn't able to say. So I produced a box of cubes, and each cube has got a little picture on it. And I said, okay, I want you to choose 3 pictures and put them in an order and tell a story based on the pictures. And she chose a picture of an alien, a picture of a lock, and a picture of an apple. And she told me a fable about these 3 things. She said, the apple isn't really an apple, it's a treasure. It's something these aliens really need, but no one's helping them to get it. They're locked out. And I said, okay, why are the aliens locked out? And she slipped back into the first person and she said, because we're frightened that if we help them, they'll end up in first place. So once she was equipped with a symbolic language, a symbolic vocabulary, she could finally talk about what was on her mind, which was the people in Gaza. And there's an awful lot of research literature on the role of metaphor in helping young people to talk about such difficult topics, fairy tale in particular. And now I want to share with you a fairy tale that was composed by children in Bethlehem, Samud House children. It's based on an Arabic version of Red Riding Hood, and the main theme is flight. Here we go.
أجلستها. روحي أعطي الملوخية لستك.
باي ماما.
ديري بالك.
صباح الخير تيتا، شوفي شو جبتلي.
شكرا حبيبتي.
ستها بتحبها كتير، عشان هيك سوت فستان كله ورد خصوصي لإلها.
البنت الصغيرة شافت الفستان كتير حلو، عشان هيك صارت تلبسه كل يوم.
عشان هيك صار الكل يحكي لها وردة. مرحبا وردة.
مرحبا وردة. فيها صباح لتحضير الملوخية إلى وردة.
روحي أعطي الملوخية لستك.
وردة تركت البيت بس في الطريق
شافت حياة كبيرة ما قدرت تكمل الطريق.
مرحبا وردة، ليش بتعيطي؟ لازم أروح عند ستي بس مش قادر أمرق.
لازم ترمي حجار عشان تقدر تكسر الحيط.
شو بتسوي يا وردة؟ بدي أكسر الحيط عشان أروح عند ستي.
هيك مش راح ينفع، أنا راح أساعدك.
شكرا.
وردة تسلقت الشجرة بس الحيط كان كتير عالي، ما قدرتش تروح على الجهة التانية. شو بتسوي فوق يا وردة؟
بدي أروح عند ستي اللي ساكنة في الجهة التانية.
أنا راح أساعدك.
الساحر شافها وأعطاها القلم.
هذا القلم قلم مميز، ارسم اللي بتحلم فيه بتشوفي شو بصير.
شكرا.
وردة
وردة بتروح تعطي الأكل لستها على ظهر العصفور.
That was a version of Red Riding Hood composed by children in Bethlehem who were struggling to cope with being separated from some relatives after the building of the wall, and we asked them to imagine how they could reach the other side if they really wanted. And that was what they came up with. And this image of the bird, I have to say, it recurs in many, many of the stories told by youth, especially Palestinian youth, this idea of flight, of going far away and of returning home. And moving on from this idea of crossing boundaries, for the final part of my talk, I just want to look at how forbidden stories cross boundaries. Stories that carry a social or a political taboo. This is a major, major component of my work, as in Israel and Palestine, all people are living under the weight of very dark and very frightening histories. When I say forbidden history, I mean a history that's taboo on the national level, so very difficult to talk about publicly. It's often traumatic. It's usually transmitted orally, again because of difficulties with publishing in the public sphere. And its narrators or its protagonists are usually members of a powerless or a marginalized group. These are the characteristics of forbidden history that I've identified in my research. And in the Israeli case, the prime example of forbidden history is the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for disaster, and it refers to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948. At least 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes. Their homes were either confiscated or destroyed, and those who remained were placed under a military rule that lasted until 1966. This isn't widely talked about in Israeli schools, and recently the Education Ministry confiscated a Hebrew language history textbook aimed at high schoolers because it described the events of 1948 as ethnic cleansing. And for these restrictions also affect Palestinians with Israeli citizenship as a segregated education system. So most Palestinians are in Arabic language schools, but they too had a textbook that mentioned the Nakba in Arabic, and that was withdrawn by the Education Ministry. And for Palestinians, this is obviously all very recent and very raw. One 15-year-old girl named Bisan, a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, she said to me, the Nakba, we carry it. So for her, it's a burden and something she's conscious of all the time and a weight on her back. And they get frustrated because what they're carrying at the moment isn't acknowledged on the public level, even though it's very integral to their lives. And Jewish Israelis naturally have a very similar relationship with the Holocaust. One of the Israeli Jewish kids I worked with, he described the Holocaust as an important part of my family, almost as though it's a relative. A lot of the kids have survivors among their grandparents and great-grandparents, and a lot of the kids have grown up conscious that there are many, many family members they've never heard of or never met because they were murdered. And in Palestinian society, on a public level, there is a huge taboo against acknowledging this. Back in 2012, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency decided they were going to include the story of the Holocaust in a textbook for Palestinian kids in refugee camps. UNRWA controls the curriculum in refugee camps. and they were threatened with a strike from the teachers' union. And one of the teachers in the union said, "I would sooner lose my job than teach my students to sympathize with the same people who took our land." So there's a lot of belligerence and a sense, again, that history is competitive, that if we acknowledge this Holocaust, it means forgetting our Nakba, it means forgetting our rights. And among Israelis, there's a sense of, oh, well, if we talk about the Nakba, if we even begin to think about being sorry, then that means compromising our right to be safe here. So people are at a deadlock on the public level. But in the private sphere, it's a bit different, because as I've already shown, there are chinks and cracks in this wall, and stories are getting across. And one really good example of the transmission of forbidden history that actually inspired my whole PhD project involves the diary of Anne Frank in Bethlehem in the early 2000s during the Second Palestinian Uprising, when the whole city was under frequent curfew, tanks were in the streets, no one could go in or out, and of course the kids couldn't get to school. So their school teacher, Susan Atalla, decided that she'd ask them to keep a diary of their experiences as a home assignment. And whenever curfew was lifted, she sent them reading material. She sent them chunks of children's diaries written in other conflict zones, mainly as a way to let her students know that they weren't alone. And the first diary she sent out was Zlata's diary of Zlata Filipovic, who's a child who was growing up in Sarajevo during the Balkans War. And after that, Miss Atalla thought, you know what, I'm going to send out the diary of Anne Frank. And at first, her students, who were all teenage girls, they flat out refused to read it. They said, no, we're not touching this. But partly because they were locked up in a house with nothing to do, they eventually started to read it, and they were gripped by it. They were gripped by the commonality of experience. They were 15-year-old girls who didn't dare go near a window in case they were shot. And here was a 15-year-old girl who didn't dare go near a window in case she was found out and killed. And they were so fascinated by the diary that their parents started reading it as well. And soon Susan Atalla found out she didn't have enough copies for all the people who wanted to read this book. And one of my colleagues at Samud Story House, a Dutch man who's married to a Palestinian woman, he was the only one who had any freedom of movement at this point. They sent him to Jerusalem to buy up every English language copy of Anne Frank's diary that he could, and he came across the checkpoint with the boot of his car full of them, and it was like a circulating library of Anne Frank. And one of the Palestinian girls was so moved by it that she started to write her own diary entries, Dear Kitty, from Bethlehem in the year 2004. And so that's one example of how forbidden history can penetrate a society through creative writing, through storytelling, through the arts, and foster a very, very empathetic response that as yet doesn't exist on the public level. And one of my Jewish participants, his name's Emmanuel, he described a similar thing happening with the Nakba in his own life. He attends a very special school. It's one of only a handful of integrated schools in the entire country. It's a private school, non-state. Palestinians and Israeli students go to class together. Classes are taught in both Hebrew and Arabic. The aim is to get the kids fluent in both. And they learn these histories. And Emmanuel was saying to me that he'd encountered the Nakba because the grandparents of Palestinian students had come into the school and told the class what had happened to them. Now, Emmanuel is the child who said that the Holocaust is a big part of his family. And he said to me, as part of his own growth in the region, he has found that learning about Nakba and learning about Holocaust needn't be an antagonistic experience. He said, sharing stories has helped me to see that this is a place where we could get closer and we could learn to understand each other. Because, you know, we both had families once, and then someone banished us and we couldn't go back. And he said he wasn't comparing the exact experience, the experience of genocide with the experience of ethnic cleansing. He was comparing the fact that both peoples here have lost something, and they're never going to get that back. Like for Bisan, the Palestinian child, she's got relatives in refugee camps in Lebanon, and she's never going to know who they are. There's no way for her to find out. And the time is coming when she's going to have to. learn to face that. Because no matter what we do for justice, we can't give that back to her. And for Emmanuel, many of his relatives died in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, and they aren't coming back either. And so for him, sharing the stories of this loss and what it means in the present day is a way forward to peace. And it's a way to get closer to ending. And that brings me to the last strand of my talk, which is about endings. When I was working with the children, I always placed special attention on the end of stories and the endings they narrate in their stories. Like for some of the older teenagers, they're starting talking about the end of childhood. Israeli teenagers are conscripted into the military at the age of 18, and so they were speaking about this in a big way, what it means to be going forward to the army, their fears, their hopes about it. Palestinian kids in particular were speaking a lot about death. Many of the Palestinians have been bereaved in this conflict. One of the girls who came to Sumud House when she participated for the first time, she really, really struggled to write a story. She just wrote, "What can I say? Almost everyone I love has died." And that was all she could say. And for some Israeli youth too, there's bereavement. Like the 17-year-old boy I was working with from the settlement of Anshwood, he spoke to me about the constant fear he has that someone he loves is going to die. Very recently, a Palestinian gunman shot a man outside the gates of his settlement. And he told me, I'm friends with his daughter, his son's a good friend of mine, and everyone loved him. And the fear of something happening to someone you love is worse than the fear of something happening to you. And for Yair, when I asked him to tell me how he imagines the end of the conflict, he said, "I hope we can learn to love each other, but it won't happen because people die in the end. That's how it ends. The conflict will be just be." So for many of the youth, there is this huge despair. But others have got hope alongside the despair. And this was the final interesting thing that emerged from my research, the ambivalence. The fact that the children can feel many multiple conflicting things, ideas. They can feel empathy at the same time as they feel hate. And the really great thing about storytelling, the really important thing, is that it allows them to feel all those things at once without judgment. That's the power of it. And so, in one storytelling session with a group of girls I got to know very, very well, who'd really shared a huge amount of very personal stuff with me, I got them narrating an end to the conflict. And they wrote a story called The Pigeon. And I'm just going to read this to you now. It's now hanging on the wall of the separation hall. There was a little boy who was holding his toy, a pigeon. While he was playing, he had a dream. He dreamed about another world where he could talk about his toys and his hobbies, his interests and his dreams, instead of talking about guns, blood, and killing. A world where he could run and play with his friends. In that world was no war, no tanks, no rockets, and no shelling and bombing. A world full of peace. A bullet, an evil bullet, came like a thief and entered his heart. It took his soul and his dream away. His pigeon was beside him, right there next to his motionless body. But the pigeon remembered the boy's dream and came to life and flew away. It decided to tell his dream to the world, and it decided to make this dream come true. talking about a pigeon, I thought they were mistranslating dove from Arabic, and I was like, "Shu bitsawi, lesh pigeon?" And because I thought they wanted the symbolism of the dove, the peace dove. But when I explained the difference between pigeon and dove in English, they were adamant that they were keeping this pigeon. They did not want any fancy pants dove. And that struck me as really important because they chose an ordinary bird as the agent of peace. And the fascinating thing about the story is that it doesn't end with peace coming. It ends with a pigeon, a very ordinary creature, deciding to make the dream come true. And it's the decision that's important and the telling of the story that's important for these kids. Now, in conclusion, I just want to say we have to be realistic about what the arts can achieve in conflict zones. Not long before I came here, a Palestinian woman in Hebron stopped me and she said, "My children have been telling you their stories for years. How's it helping them? What's going to change?" And I stood there and I looked at her, and there was a shadow of a military watchtower falling over her face. And I said to her, "I hope it means they have a nice afternoon now and again." Because we can't change the world with one story. What we can do is little things, bit by bit, step by step. And we have to go on ahead and keep doing this work, even when we can't necessarily see any evidence of big change. And one example of why I continue to do this work, of why I believe that story is very, very important, comes from the Shatila refugee camp in Lebanon. And I dare say quite a few people in here will have heard of Shatila. It was the scene of a huge massacre back in the 80s. A Lebanese Christian militia entered the camp with the complicity of the Israeli army, who sealed the exits, and camp residents were butchered. And a few years ago, an English playwright, Peter Mortimer, went to Shatila to do some theatre work with a group of girls in the camp, all of whom have lost relatives. And the play he'd written was a kind of fairy tale, and it has got the usual wicked king, and as usual with fairy tales, the wicked king dies in the end, and the good people, the innocent, they get their reward. And it was the first time the Shatila girls had been in a play or taken part in any kind of theatre arts, and they staged a mutiny, and they said, "We're not going to act this." Peter said, "Why?" And the girls said, "You need to change the ending. You're going to make that king good, so he can stay alive at the end." And they were saying something about forgiveness and reconciliation that they can't say in public using their own words, because it's still too raw and it's still too taboo. But the storytelling, it gave them the vocabulary to say it. It gave them a way to imagine a different future. And even though maybe the stories on their own are not enough to build that future, we need a just political solution. They can play a part. And so can the rest of the arts. And now I'm going to conclude my talk with one final story from the War Museum. It's about the power of the arts, and it's called The Accordion. When I was 17, I bought an accordion. I wanted to let the children be happy, to change their situation a bit. During the uprising, when nobody could go out, I opened my home for the children and I played the accordion for them on the veranda.